to Nothing Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Many times, when we think about human history, what we're really considering is the developments that have taken place quite recently. Usually events that have occurred between a few hundred and a few thousand years ago. However, we know from scientific findings that modern humans have been around for at least 60,000 years, and possibly longer than 200,000 years. So the question which philosophers and scientists alike ask themselves is, what were we doing all of that time? Today we're discussing the Sapient Paradox.
I love that. I just think, well, we're sitting twiddling our collective thumbs.
Yeah, so you and I were talking about a little bit before we got on the air, but that's the tricky part about prehistory is that there's no records. There's no written records. So without written records, it's very hard to determine what was happening. And things have gotten, we've made scientific discoveries since then that have really only, in my view anyways, complicated the picture even more. But we'll get into that a little bit. We'll start with what is the Sapient Paradox?
I will start with that, but I'm not going to get us off track, but I just want to acknowledge that this is the anniversary of the death of Ludwig Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein, to me, is directly applicable to this. So we'll get to that. Okay. The Sapient Paradox, well, you've essentially said it. It was posited or coined by a very well-regarded scientist who I think now is 85, sociologist, a field crosser, many books, many articles, named Renfrew, and he essentially was looking at the time period of humanity, whether it's 200,000 years or 100,000 years, but only in the past 10,000 or so, according to what he's determining for all kinds of reasons, salient scientific reasons, but that we just started growing up.
Yeah.
And so, as you said, the question is, why were we around so long before we started taking off? Now, Bill, so that's in a nutshell.
Yeah, and what I was talking about just a couple minutes ago with the picture getting more complicated is that, so Colin Renfrew sort of started talking about the Sapient Paradox in 1994, so it's very recent, less than 30 years old. And at that time, they were thinking that, modern humans emerged about 60,000 years ago and then developed writing possibly as early as 40,000 years ago, but probably later than that. And then, about 12,000 years ago, we started, there's the agricultural revolution things.
Right.
But since that time, they've made scientific findings in caves in France and other places that have moved that timeline even further back in history. So now they're saying, well, modern humans may have existed 100, 200, or even 300,000 years ago, with, possible evidence for written language and symbolic communication going back possibly as far as 170,000 years ago. So the farther back in history you move the timeline, the more perplexing it becomes that nothing, quote unquote, seemed to happen until 12,000 years ago. Yeah. But we refer to early humans as prehistoric, but that's not technically true, as we're sort of talking about right now.
Right.
What do we know about them?
Well, as you said, we know that there were agricultures. There were the current work would suggest that, without doing too many blanket statements, but that there were as many variants of culture as there would be for a diverse species like ourselves. And so many ways of farming, many models of governing or of being in a communal existence. None of them idyllic, because it's always it's always misplaced to assume that, because many cultures had chattel slavery, and that's a big deal. But it was ensconced in various ways. Some did not. It, their food was as different as it could possibly be, along a coastline of a couple hundred miles difference in some cases. There was the art thing is what always gets complicated, because there are those like Renfrew who sort of marginalize and, if not trivialize, put it in corners of things that are found in non-Western traditional places. So the point with him, part of the point that he goes after, is that art didn't really emerge much. But people jump to the caves of Lascaux when you look at the dating on that. But that's only one example, and he's saying there's not really that much around. A few trinkets, some jewelry, a couple of paintings here and there in a cave. But I think that's, and I lack humility saying this, I think that's short-sighted. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying his work is that this man is an exceeding genius at the work that he does. But we all have blinders, and I think that the more we uncover things, the more we find that maybe we have to stretch our definitions of art. When we work in our own paradigms or our own models, and that's what makes history so hard. We don't see things that we don't think to see.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think that there was agriculture, there was art to some extent, there were some playing is too whimsical a word, but some experiments with money or trade or those kind of things. There technology, the weaponry, the cooking implements, and so on were clearly changing from flake to flint and to stone and beyond, and so it's not like we were just sitting around doing nothing.
Yeah, and it's not even fair to say we weren't sitting around doing nothing, right? Because in the article that you and I were reading, that sort of inspired our search into the question and down the rabbit hole of research. One of the ones they talk about is Homo erectus, I think.
Yes.
Who they have evidence that which is not human in the sense of the word that we prescribe to it, but as we've talked about in the past few weeks with speciesism, right? We tend to place in categories things that are different from us. But so this is a relative of humanity, who had culture, right? And what they found was that when these beings lived in close proximity, their tools and their technology developed at a faster pace. Whereas when there was evidence they were spread out, their development stagnated some. So yeah, there was obviously, when I put, nothing was happening in quotation marks earlier, that's where the quotation marks come in, is that by nothing, we mean, we're talking about the exponential advancements humans have made.
That's it.
In the past. It. I mean, if you think about it, 100 years ago, nobody had ever been to space. There were no jets. You had prop planes. World War I, people were bomber planes. In World War I, people were just holding bombs over the side of a prop plane and dropping them. 100 years before that, there was no cars. Hot air balloons were just being invented. The first camera was being invented. These are 100-year time increments. We're talking 100 of thousands of years of time increments. So it's huge scales of time. So the perplexing question of the Sapient Paradox isn't necessarily positing that nothing happened, but it's positing that advancement was taking place at such a slow rate, and we don't know why that is.
Yeah, and there are counter arguments that put the matter to a metaphor. You take small steps as you're learning to walk, before you take larger ones. I think implied in this, I mean, he says the most significant developments in society and technology took place in the last 10,000 years. Well, significant by what measure?
Right,
I'm not
yes.
suggesting they are. And he's not using the word progress, because then I would really revolt. But just because you have computers doesn't mean you've progressed.
Right.
I mean, you've progressed in your technological wizardry, but that doesn't necessarily mean. I mean, I'm glad that we can sit and talk to people around the planet on a Saturday. That's amazing. Does that make us a better species?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I'm in a position to really. I don't want to make a judgment call on that. But there are lots of other things going on that we'll get to, and so how you use language, which is what Wittgenstein was all about. To frame or to contextualize or to privilege certain phases of history is worth thinking about.
Yeah. And so this is sort of foreshadowing kind of the three major views on the Sapient Paradox that we'll get to. But I think before we get there, there's a kind of a fun question to ask, which is, what were early humans' views on their histories? So, like we were talking about, prehistoric humans, we don't have any written records of what was going on.
No.
But when people started to write things down, or oral traditions that have existed prior to that time that have been passed down, what did people generally say about their histories?
Well, oral traditions are always tricky too, because the people who started only 100 to maybe 200 years ago to try to collect oral histories. Well, not everybody who's intruded upon by somebody else who says, "Can you tell me your story?" is going to tell you. There was a lot of tomfoolery going on, solely righteously. So, yes, there was some significant translation and so on. But even that, if we take the stories that we have and we take them as honestly shared and we learn from, and there has been much of that, more than we probably deserve. Cultures tend to think of themselves as the people. That definite article, no matter how you translate it, shows up in cultures around the planet. Tend to think that they have a system that functions well. It's not any different than us,
right?
Really, in that sense, want good lives for their families and their communities, and sort of look askance at something that's too new.
Yeah, so ancient humans weren't that different from modern humans, and that gets at the heart of the Sapient Paradox, is that these humans that were around 60 to 300,000 years ago were physiologically identical to us, right?
Essentially. Well, and the varieties of humanity. When you talk about,
yes,
this is no small thing. We've talked about Neanderthals before as an example. Neanderthals. As one set of writers has pointed out time and time again, you would be hard-pressed if dressed in current clothing to know the alternate Homo not sapien on a subway.
Right.
But still, you have a culture in which you have a planet, and there was not planetary communication going on. You have a place where if peoples did encounter each other, they probably realized they were encountering somebody different from them, but not in the ways that we think of as different.
Yeah, I'm going to introduce a scientific concept because I think it will help.
Yeah.
Both with this and with what you were previously talking about, people from a different culture not being willing to just tell their story to an anthropologist or that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that's ecological validity. And this is a concept that gets kind of pushed to the side in a lot of science media. Anybody who enjoys science, your Google newsfeed will start popping up with, latest study talks about this.
Yes.
Even if you don't like science, you probably see this once in a while in your newsfeed. Study shows this. Science and the gold standard of science, right, is these randomized controlled trials. But an important part of the scientific process is that there's a trade-off, right? You're going to get a result that gets most at the cause of an effect in a randomized controlled laboratory experiment. But in a laboratory randomized control experiment, those conditions are most divorced from what the behavior is likely, where the environment that the behavior is likely to be produced in. So when an anthropologist goes to a people and says, tell me your story, and they tell him a story, the story that they tell him is probably going to be very dependent on the ecological validity of the anthropologist's approach. So if he's made some attempt to connect with and embed himself into the society and attempt to understand them and shown an honest effort, he might get different results than somebody who shows up in a white coat, doesn't bother to learn the language, and just says, tell me your story through a translator, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of the same thing with hominid species interacting in the past. If we look at the evidence, right, it can be easy to say, oh, well, based off of these cave markings or, this campfire or whatever, these are how the hominid species interacted.
Yep.
But the ecological validity really demonstrates that it's much more complicated than that, right? We know that humans and Neanderthals and other hominid species competed. We also know that they interbred. And it's kind of like what you were saying earlier. We have examples of egalitarian societies, of chattel slavery societies, with no civilization, no media, no communication networks. Every group, every tribe of hominids had its own self-governance, its own ways of doing things.
And so very complicated ways.
Yeah. And so each one of them, when they came into contact with another group, was likely to have just as diverse a number of interactions, whether it was wiping them out or, assimilating and interbreeding or trading and having
playing
purely
one set against another set against another set to ensure their own survival.
Yeah. So this idea of ecological validity basically says, when we're examining, especially when we're examining prehistoric topics, when we're looking at things that happened before there's records, we have to be very careful about trying to definitively say anything happened a certain way, because we don't have access to observing what happened. All we're looking at is very scant evidence from the very distant past.
That's wonderful you brought this up for many reasons, but primarily what you just said. We like, it's the illusion of explanatory depth. We like to think we know more than we do.
Yeah.
It's really hard to say. I don't know. And then when you have some anthropologists and scientists respectfully taking, as they need to, as they should, issue with the Sapient Paradox by saying, look, the radical break, as they call it, between whatever else there was and human advancement was when you start finding artifacts and adornments. And that goes back 70,000 years. Okay, so what happens if you find an artifact, an adornment, a coin from 100,000 years ago? And, all right, well, yeah, but that still doesn't, that just makes it all worse. Why did it take even longer?
Yes.
In order, as we said at the beginning, but we're assuming that it wasn't happening. As you said, ecologically, we're not thinking hard, I think, about the conditions of the microcultures.
Yeah. And also the time scale, right? Because, and I'm not endorsing this viewpoint or saying that there's any kind of evidence for it. But what I'm saying is purely as a thought experiment, which we do a lot on a philosophy podcast, right?
Right.
Hundreds of thousands of years is plenty of time for primitive civilizations to arise and fall with no way of knowing that it happened, right? People could build small towns or villages out of mud huts. They could have agriculture in isolated places of the world and survive like that for hundreds of years. And then all of that could get wiped out by a climate change or by a violent species or something. And then you have no record of it.
And that's why we avoid the word primitive, because it has that whole Western white crap built into it. It's one step away from the word savage, which the Brits and everyone loved to use for hundreds of years. No, if you can build something that lasts in an ice age. We have already I've forgotten the title of the book, but it's essentially what would happen across 1 year, 5 years, 10 years if we were not here, if we were just gone.
Yeah,
you've seen the book, right?
Yes, yes.
And there have been shows about it. Right? In less than a few months, whole system shut down. In a year, vines have grown up over our buildings, and most things are collapsing. We think we are so high and mighty.
Yeah, I've got an anecdotal example of that where my brother and I have 60 acres of woodland, and there's a cabin there now, and we know in the past that there used to be other structures. And so as we were clearing out some forest and stuff, we found there's a stone foundation. And there's nothing on top of it, and it's just these old mossy stones, and half of them have fallen off each other and stuff. And you go, man, what would this have been? We'll never know because it was so long ago. And then one day, a guy stopped by and he goes, hey, my name's so and so, and my dad used to own this land, and he sold it to your dad. And so we had a good long chat with him, and we asked him about it. He goes, oh yeah, we were trying to dam up some water to get the stream to go farther down land. And we go, wait, so you put those stones there? He goes, oh yeah, that was probably 40 years ago.
And you were thinking hundreds, and
we were thinking it was probably the 1800s, but especially in the climate we live in with the humidity and things just rot and decompose and go to dust. And that's not the same everywhere in the world. In some very dry climates, you have access. I remember going out west to the Four Corners area and climbing through Anasazi Indian ruins and finding, some places that still had thatched roofs on them and things. So it's different across the world, but yeah. So this roughly 10% of our existence is historically documented. Why are there no earlier records? So right? So the obvious answer is that there's no language or there's no writing. But why? Why is it?
Well, why wouldn't there be writing? Well, we assume that, and we assume it for many, many reasons from evolutionary standpoints. But what medium would survive or could survive? I think, as I said this before we started the show, this is just me, and humbly, truly asserted that the further we get away from whatever time period we're talking about, I think the less likely we are to have evidentiary material, because of everything that can be worn and torn and eroded and so on. Let's suppose we didn't have anything more. Let's suppose we could never find anything else. We found the last archaeological find. That's not going to be true, but and then we have that perplexion. It's not a paradox; it's a perplexity. How can we know? We want to know, and the short answer is, well, probably we can't. But why do we want to think what we think? Why didn't they have language? Why didn't they have writing? Well, if they certainly well, probably had language. Of course, their language was in development, but it was oral. Why? They didn't need to maintain it. There wasn't. We think about what Plato said about writing, but he did it himself. And so we are hypocritical creatures most of the time. So I don't think that should be the baseline for making conjectures.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Because I think that there's several things that come up there. One is that most of these societies were very small. So there wasn't really any need. I mean, if we think about written correspondence, lots of times that's meant to travel over distance, or it's meant to record something so that, there's a public record of it. If you have a small society, you don't need to send things over distance. And if you have a small society, you don't need to have something recorded. If you have everybody that you know is there watching a transaction happen, then everybody knows it.
But
right?
There's also this, and some anthropologists assert this too, and it's something we need to point out. If you have a small society and your storyteller gets killed in a hunt, you've lost that memorization. If you have a very small collective and people with skills are gone, then you don't transfer those skills. They are skills that have to be relearned or assimilated from others if you encounter them. And so there's not this, we can't conceive of this really. We should be able to, science fiction does, but we seem to just fall into our, well, why do they write it down? Well,
right.
Let's say you've got this 80 people, and each has a designated task, and maybe there's a second who they're trying to teach. But a walloping fire happens. Somebody goes off a cliff. Somebody is killed by a bear. Where's your knowledge? And so, to me, that's part of the explanation of
I think
slowness.
Yeah, because
so-called.
We 300,000 years, 60,000 years is a long span of time. So obviously, this not only happened, but it happened to every prehistoric culture. That's why we don't have, we have oral traditions, and probably some of the most legitimate would be Australian Aboriginal people, or maybe some Inuits and these types. But by and large, those oral traditions don't exist, or they don't exist in a reliable format because things happen, right? And especially the longer the time frame you have, the more likely it is that something's going to happen that's going to interrupt those lineages and interrupt those stories and those timelines and devastate the cultures.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's a big part of it. And I think that the lack of a need for writing is a big part of it. I also think that preservation of writing is a part of it, right? Like you were saying, how long it takes for things to degrade. They find, in places that are very conducive to preservation, the Dead Sea Scrolls and things. These things are only 2,000 years old, right? Yeah. But they still can't even unravel the scrolls because the paper will disintegrate. They have to use X-rays to look through the rolled up scroll and read what's on the pages, right? So if that's in, a conducive spot, then before, even if you had papyrus way back when, it would disintegrate. If you had a clay tablet, it would melt. Other than the cave writings, right? Which, in addition to being art, are a way of communicating, right? They drew a buffalo. That probably means buffalo. There wasn't a need for a word.
A metaphor,
right? Yeah. So, you have, so I think that there's multiple elements going into the preservation, the need, and also, some of those other things. So I think now's a good point to introduce sort of the three big theories of what was going on during that time. Do you want to give a
okay. So I'm going to do this by way of Hobbes and Rousseau. So Thomas Hobbes in the 1600s, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 1700s, they're often cast as having an argument with each other, even though they weren't exactly contiguous for very long. Hobbes is the one that said life is brutish and short unless you form government. So one of the things that goes on way, way before Hobbes is what we think about the formation of government. Whatever we mean by that in a small communal existence, not empires, small groups. How do they organize themselves? If so, how do they organize themselves? What are they? And in the dawn of everything, this book that I was referencing by two guys named David, one of whom has passed, looks at and presents all kinds of evidentiary material. They sometimes way overgeneralize or leap off from less than certain material, but that there were varieties of cultures that we have come to know that change their form of government depending on a season. Can you imagine this for us? So that there would be a time when there would be the male primarily, but not exclusively, the hunting thing going on, where you could have a tyrannical male, you could have whoever, but he's in charge, leading the hunt, so to speak. But winter comes, everything's brought in. The switches to the matriarchal and to the communal, and you have that by the season. Oh, we're going to try this on, see how it works for this, but then we're going to shift our government entirely for this. Now, to me, that is a much more fluid and forward-thinking paradigm, complicated, than we could even imagine, than we could handle. I can't imagine any so-called Western industrialized, post-industrial culture saying, yeah, we're going to change our form for these months, but then we're going to go back to this. We can't even handle a time change. So to suggest that wasn't innovative and or progressive or complicated, I think is to really miss something. And so that's one of the reasons I like this book. So that's one of them, is that governments, forming governments. Second one is gossip. Did you?
Yes.
Have you ever,
yes.
Okay, so you go ahead. I'm dominating the floor here.
Yeah, the gossip trap is an interesting one. And one thing that we haven't touched on that is kind of interesting is that a lot of these things sort of have a relationship with cosmological study, right? So when you're talking about, the farther we get from the beginning, the less we can actually know about it. That's kind of similar to dark energy, right? If now we can see so far back in time, but the longer time goes on, actually the less far back we can know what happened. So the gossip trap operates on sort of the same thought as the Fermi Paradox's great filter, right? Which states that, we wouldn't be contacted by any alien civilizations until we reached a certain point of technological advancement. Well, the gossip trap essentially says, and it's related to what you were just talking about, in a small culture, the primary governing rule, the rule of the people, right? The leveling social force is gossip.
Yeah.
So if you have, and I think you can see this happen in most workplaces, unfortunately. You have people working, and then somebody gets promoted, right? So somebody that used to be a peer is now a supervisor.
Yeah.
You have a mix of reactions to this. You have some people that think it's, oh, good, they're well suited to it, they deserve it. But you have other people that get jealous, or they think they deserved it, or they think that maybe the person was just a bad pick. Or, maybe they legitimately know something about the person's character that they think invalidates them from that position. Well, the natural course of events is for some of these malcontented people to start talking together and to start spreading their conjectures around the office. And before you know it, you have the group of peers. The group of workers is always the larger group than management, always, right? And that's just the structure of an organization. So all of a sudden you have all of these people on the floor, poisoned against the newly appointed leader, right? And now the group does not function as it should. in modern times, there's, written rules, right? There's codexes that make it so that the organization can continue on in whatever form it wants to. But before those things existed, right, you can imagine a point, and it's probably very similar to why the theory of government that you just described worked, right? And it also describes why we have the alpha male as a myth, right? Is because if you have a small culture, if the hunting's good, your main hunter is going to be the guy in charge, right? Look at this guy. He knows what he's talking about. Everywhere we go, we're finding antelope. We're killing them.
For the hunting.
Full. Right.
Right, for the hunting.
But when the seasons change, when the climate changes, right? And your main hunter is going out to hunt and he's not coming back with anything, your small group can look around and go, well, who knows something about what berries we can eat, right? She knows what berries we can eat. She's she's coming back with loads of berries every day. She's going to tell us what to do, right? So the shifting of the government is easy in that small group because you're looking to whoever has expertise and whoever is ensuring the survival of the group at the time. The gossip trap is that, but in reverse. It's the inverse position where rather than proactively promoting who is helping your society, yes, it's undermining the leaders that you think are not promoting it. So if you have a great hunter, rather than everybody supporting him because he's a great hunter, you will have people that in the back of their minds think they could be a better hunter, or they have some personal vendetta against this guy.
Yeah.
And so the gossip travels among the group, and before you know it, the group is poisoned against him. And without any written rules that protect this guy, right? Suddenly he's disparaged, he's put down, and somebody else is raised up.
This is where Rousseau comes in. I'm oversimplifying, but just for the point. So Hobbes is saying you need a government which is bigger than any of the people in order to have a sovereign, to make decisions that individuals would likely mess up because we're so self-absorbed. Rousseau is saying, well, no, the better model is just to trust each other individually because humans are essentially good, and so they'll make the decisions. Well, okay, it's operating on probably a flawed principle, but then we have the gossip trap, and the difficulty for us now, and I think this is what has to, it colors what we think going backwards. We have the biggest gossip trap that any humans could ever have created. We have the internet, we have Facebook, Instagram, blah, 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 blah. And so people are constantly, conspiratorially undermining other people without knowledge, without basis, other than to extol themselves, or because they want to pretend they know something that they don't, that makes them feel better, or they want to be heroes, or whatever all the multiple motivations are. But essentially, it erodes government. It erodes the idea of authority, which is what Hobbes was talking about. And we've talked about authority before, too. And so when you have that so that anybody can say, well, I know better than any authority, X, Y, and Z, then you are not going to make progress. We are, I think, arguably, in a position where we say, we wonder why it took so long for us to get here. Maybe the answer is, it's not a here that we necessarily thought we would get to.
Yeah. And that's, so we've sort of covered the three positions together. So we'll break them apart a little bit. One of them that we were just talking about is the gossip trap, which this is a legitimate theory about how the Sapient Paradox proceeded. It says that over that huge course of human history where we didn't seem to make any significant progress, the reason we didn't is because we were living in these small groups, and that these small groups were governed by gossip, essentially. And so there was no way to establish a formalized government because anybody that was trying to sort of make progress was getting cut down. So you don't have innovation. Right. If you're the wrong kind of person, nobody likes you. So no matter what you do, it's going to be discounted. That's a human quality. So that's the gossip trap. Yeah. Another one, which is really interesting and that we sort of alluded to earlier in the episode, is this idea that it just seems like nothing is happening during that time. But really, the most important aspects of what make us humans today we're developing, which is language, culture, these sorts of things.
Yep.
And so if you think about it, it's one thing to say, anatomically identical human beings existed 300,000 years ago. And what does that do, right? Our initial thought is to plop ourselves down 300,000 years ago and say, yeah, how did I not know to invent language or government or these sorts of things, right? But that's really just a sort of false perception, right?
Mm-hmm.
With all the same machinery, and we explore this on the show quite a bit, right? Again, what you were talking about with Aboriginal or, with like ancient people's oral histories and things, the position of humanity is always, we've got it right. Yeah, we know what's going on, right? Yeah. And the great thing about a philosophy podcast is we demonstrate on a weekly basis that is not true. Right? So to say that, well, why didn't we invent language? Well, as a philosopher, rather than plopping our modern selves down in the past, we have to envision this abstract thought experiment where we have the faculties that we have, but we have no understanding of language as an adult person. We have no conception of government as an adult person, right? And if you try to put yourself in that headspace, it's not possible. But if you try to put yourself in that headspace, all of a sudden you go, how would I survive? How would I make any kind of meaningful advancement in my lifetime? And the thing is, the phylogeny of the species is very much predicated on people's lifetimes. And so if no individual person can make any progress because they don't have language, they don't have culture, then how does adding time on help? It really doesn't, right? You need to make those breakthroughs before you can make any progress. So that's the other paradigm, is that, things did indeed go slow, but
by our standards,
right? But by going slow, once developing language and developing culture, if you factor in the importance, the monolithic importance of those two things, all of a sudden the curve looks much less exponential and much more linear. Not based upon the material accomplishments, but based upon the building blocks needed, right? It's like you're taking the one giant cornerstone and putting it down, then you're building all the little stones on top of it, right?
This is why I find Wittgenstein very, very appropriate to the topic. I mean, he believed that language didn't represent an exterior reality. It is an instrument, a tool woven into our practice. And so language is life. We create our reality through language. Well, what is your language developing to do? And how does because the language is a container for the stories you tell. The language is a container for the knowledge that you want to pass out. And so if you have like the meaning of a word, when someone explains a word to us, what are we doing? We've talked about this before, but I think we have to come back to it. We are using other words to explain it.
Right.
We are using abstractions conceptualized from an abstraction, made manifest in morphemes and phonemes, sound, that we then associate with something that everyone would understand, we think should understand. And now we have oversimplified ourselves so much in our own rhetoric that we get angry if somebody doesn't understand immediately what we're talking about. Well, why would they? Because they're talking about some of the most abstract concepts there is. Truth, justice, the American way, nice Superman stuff. But we don't know what we're talking about because we're all talking about vastly different things. And we can sit here in the 21st century and say, well, we certainly have done better than all of those folks to come. You just said it, the building block of all of it, I would assert, is language.
Yeah. It's almost all of our modern advances and adornments are really just like shingles on a roof. Language and culture are the house. So without those modern adornments, it's raining in here. It doesn't seem like it's a very good shelter, but really that's what the bones of the whole thing are. The progress that we've made is predicated on these huge fundamental aspects of what makes us human. And even today, right? If I just made a random sound and pointed at a thing, you would understand that, oh, okay, so that sound represents that thing to him. But imagine a time in human history where that was not available to you because you didn't have the internal monologue, the already established words to understand what the thing was being described, right? And this is that importance of ontogeny versus phylogeny, right? Ontogeny, the concept of what somebody learns throughout their lifetime, contrasted with phylogeny, which is what the species learns over the course of its existence. They're intimately interwoven, right? If you don't have people learning during their lifetime, there's nothing to pass on to anybody else.
Right.
And so to me, this is a very important theory for
what do you pass on? You pass on practice if you can manage to pass that on. This is how we do X. This is how we do Y. You pass on belief, which is founded pretty much on, and not disparaging, but belief is founded pretty much on nothing.
Yeah.
And so you pass these things on. Well, if you pass on a belief, you are, and it's not passing on and being believed in exactly the same way, no matter how staunchly somebody tries to adhere to it, you are affecting the shape of culture. And so, the existentialism comes to mind again. There, we have the freedom to change our values.
Yeah.
But people get really upset about changing what they think of as a value. And so if we experience this now in a culture that can communicate on a planetary basis instantaneously, how much more difficult would that have been?
Yeah, and so we'll look at Colin Renfrew's idea, which was that essentially agriculture spurred modern human development. So his idea was that up until 12,000 years ago, the species was unable to settle down and grow crops. And so as a result, every human civilization was a tribe that was sort of nomadic, just roaming around, hunting, gathering. But they weren't able to set down roots. They weren't able to build permanent buildings and to
some built permanent buildings, but then they wandered. They nomaded away, doing their thing. But then they'd return to the buildings. They found all kinds of structures the structures out of mammoths, for instance, that were used for ritual practice once a year, to the place to which you would return, change your practice for the duration of the time being there, and then go back out.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's sort of his idea. And so the three ideas: you have your gossip trap, right? You have your re-examination of prehistory, and sort of contextualizing the importance of language and culture. Mm-hmm. And then you have agriculture and permanent civilizations as being that. To me, the one that seems the most inspiring there is that re-examining of prehistory, because both of the other two, the gossip trap and the arising of agriculture, both assumed that language was in place before then, and humans still didn't make meaningful improvements. And to me, that seems very hard to conceptualize. I think that if language arises, right, and suddenly you have this ability to communicate, that is what really would spur, the development of the species.
Yes,
in my mind.
But I agree. But what we mean again by development, this is
right.
back to Wittgenstein. Okay, so it's because we do this a lot, even though he says, "Don't for heaven's sake be afraid of talking nonsense." but you must pay attention to your nonsense, which is as much as to say speculate like crazy. But what's leading you to that speculation, and where do you?
Yeah, and so development, the concept of development, this comes back to what you were saying before. What's getting passed on during the ontogeny of a person's lifetime? Practice and belief, right? Well, practice and belief, both back then and now, right, tend to encourage rote behaviors. They don't tend to encourage innovation or exploration. So, even if you could have language conceivably, right? But if your language is saying, don't travel outside this area because it's not safe. Don't try eating this thing because it's not safe. There's no value to, animals are to be avoided at all costs because they could kill you, that sort of thing. Well, that's going to hamper the quote unquote development of your species because you're not going to have access to furs to heat yourself or meat to grow larger brains or, possibly more, areas that are more ecologically available for harvesting certain plants that might be beneficial to you.
I'm going to walk way out on the thinnest ice possible and say we have a pop cultural example for this in a Disney film cartoon, which I know there are all kinds of things that could be tossed at me for saying this, and rightly so, because I'm talking nonsense. But Moana, essentially, it's a parable about a culture a marvelous culture that has established itself. I know it's fictionalized, but it draws on roots of various things on an island, and they have a rich storytelling, but they start not paying attention to their storytelling and just tell the stories about safety and everything we need is right here and always will be right here, except when it isn't. And then somebody has to really break out in order to make sure that the culture continues. And I think that, not to put too fine a point on it, that is partly in this discussion that we're having.
Yeah.
I mean, another Wittgenstein, right on, he says at one point in his writing, Tractatus, I'm sitting with a philosopher in the garden. He says again and again, I know that is a tree, pointing to a tree that is near us. Someone else arrives and hears this, and I tell him, this fellow isn't insane. We are only doing philosophy. What I know is not much. I know less than Renfrew on this topic. I'm not suggesting in the least that I have any counter argument that would somehow. I'm not interested in taking down his research. It's not a weapon. It's not it's a speculation.
Yeah, if anything, rather than taking anything down, I'm more interested in trying to integrate the things, because I think that's probably where the truth lies, as it does in many things that we examine.
Things. Yeah.
Certainly we have evidence for gossip traps. Certainly we have evidence for the importance of language and culture in human civilizations. Certainly we have evidence for the importance of agriculture and government in human civilizations.
We have evidence of cultures that still exist that had 5 and 6 genders.
Right. And we also have evidence, like we were talking about earlier, that there is no one, definitive idea of what prehistory was like. We know that each tribe was likely very different, and how they interacted was different. And so the truth, right, here we go with the truth, right?
Facticity.
Right, is going to be evasive, because we are operating off of a very small sliver of evidence and observable material. And we're basically extrapolating based upon the things that we know work now, right? But that's what I've been trying to demonstrate throughout the episode, is what we know now is alien to what we were like then and what we knew then.
Yeah.
And so trying to walk back and figure it out is a worthy thing, and it's an interesting thing, but it's not something we'll ever be able to do the same way we've talked about in previous weeks with speciesism, right? And knowing that animals have a consciousness, but always trying to frame it in our own idea, right? One of my favorite documentaries was one on eyes, and the poor biologist that they had narrate it, he kept saying over and over again, all right, we're going to show you a simulation of how a mantis shrimp sees things. I have to tell you that this is a simulation. You're seeing what a mantis shrimp sees through human eyes, which doesn't mean anything at all. Right? So they put this poor guy out there, and then the whole time he's just giving disclaimers, and the whole time we're seeing these visuals and thinking, oh, wow, this is wild that this is what they see. No, that's not what they see, because we're using their eyes, and then we're looking at them through human eyes and a human brain, not through a mantis shrimp brain, not through mantis shrimp eyes, right? So we have the faintest idea based off of science, based off of philosophy, and this sort of empiricism and rationalism of what could be going on, but what is going on is completely unavailable.
This makes it wonderful. This is what we've said time and again, and will continue to. You brought up cosmology. Just this week, every week, if you read the science news, or astronomically, astrophysics, another, more galaxies being found that are doing what they shouldn't be doing. Naughty galaxies. They're not moving the way they should be moving. They're different shape than they ought to be, and it keeps changing and making, you could say undermining, but it isn't undermining. It's forcing a care and a respeculation and a re-examination, and that's what really good science does. It does not say, we have the answer, and the people who construe it that way are missing the boat on what science is about. It's about, we don't have the answer. We are seeking it, and we are finding little bits and pieces to help with the mystery. And that answer won't be complete, and there are going to be some things wrong with that answer, but we're getting closer.
Yeah.
And it's true with anthropology. It's true with astrophysics. It's just the case.
Yeah. It's always a never-ending journey. And as you just said, science isn't about facts necessarily, right? You can never prove anything in science. You're always, when you perform an experiment, you're either supporting or rejecting the null hypothesis, which is the status quo, right? And even if you find support for your experimental hypothesis, you can never say, well, this experiment proves that this thing. No, you say this experiment supports the idea that this is what's going on, right? And so the idea of science is you continue to gather evidence and it will support a paradigm, but eventually you're going to find evidence that doesn't support the paradigm. And then what happens is you have to reinvent the paradigm. Does that mean that the previous one was wrong? No, what it means is that you're operating with the best knowledge that you have. And this is where our conversation on verisimilitude comes in, right? We like to think of things as being right or things as being wrong, but really progress, especially scientifically, is just gathering the evidence that you can with the best tools that you can in the most reliable way that you can and saying, what does this point to? And then identifying that as your paradigm. But that's always going to be changing, and that's progress.
And that's history.
Right.
And this is about a long sweep of human history. But even if we go into a very narrow, short extrapolation from human history, the same kind of mistakes get made where people will say, well, this is absolutely what the founding fathers meant. You don't know that. You can't know that, and to pretend to know that.
Yeah.
It's because we parse words. We think a word is static. We're missing Wittgenstein entirely. We're missing the reality we create with our words, and so then you take that all the way back 10,000 years.
Yeah, and
which is only a small amount of time compared to
right. And that's why I think language plays such a big part in this, right? Is because much like the Cambrian explosion sort of befuddles scientists, right? Well, there was no life. Then all of a sudden there's this explosion of life, right? To Colin Renfrew's idea, this point that, well, it seemed like there was no language. Then all of a sudden there's this explosion. I saw an interesting thing this week. It's in a museum. It's the world's oldest written complaint. And so, we've talked about the first writing that there ever was, and it was a receipt for a beer transaction.
Right, exactly.
Right? Well, the oldest written complaint is a complaint that a guy wrote because he got the wrong grade of copper. Right? And you laugh and you think that's funny, but you think, well, that's the first written complaint that we have, right? The thing that he's complaining about is already very advanced. The wrong grade of copper. They were grading copper at this point for different applications, which means that, human development, right, in quotes, and human language and technology had been going on for a long time before this written complaint existed.
And it's not all that fundamentally different from something you might get in the company.
Yeah, exactly. And so, again, we're looking at these things. And like you were saying with the James Webb Space Telescope, you keep looking back and you keep going, man, these organized galaxies should not exist. Well, scientists keep looking back and finding new archaeological sites and going, man, written language and, written language or tools or art should not exist this far back. And it really deepens the mystery and it increases the need for philosophers and scientists to re-examine our preconceptions about nature and reality.
Absolutely.
So until next time, keep talking.